Hey, welcome. This is The Process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 126. This is my second in my lessons on wide receiver deep metrics. The first lesson, 125, was just an opening view of wide receivers. We're going to get a little bit deeper in this lesson. So let's see what's next. I think for everybody out there, it's pretty clear that age does affect athletic performance. Some athletes do better longer, some don't. Wide receivers probably last maybe longer than running backs. These kind of things. Quarterbacks, obviously, we've seen with Brady and whatnot that Breeze and Ben Roethlisberger that these players can last close to 40. So it does happen. So I wanted to present this data on the age, and we're talking 20 years old to 42 years old. This is the average fantasy points. Okay, and I've colorized it, so blue is high and red is low. Then the average of rushing and the average of reception yards, and this is across 21 years. And then I added counts because, like I said, it's in previous. It's important to see counts of wide receivers at each age to see the fall off, the survivorship kind of thing. You can see that the peak is 24 years old at basically 700. And notice that by age 28, we're half. 29, we're pretty close. And looks like by age 32, we have gone down to 100. So we started with 700. We're 1/7 of that. And then it starts getting very rare, 33, 34. And some of our data is, of course, going to be skewed. And you could see that ages 41 and 2, there's only one player. Could be, is that Larry Fitzgerald? I don't know who that is, but I think we can pretty much stop at 36, and it gets a little dicey even then. One might say 32 is, close to, there's enough in the pool to make some conclusions. So you're going to have to decide kind of where you think you fall. I would suggest 32. So just scanning through from 20, and there was some wide receiver, I don't know who, was 20 years old. Can you imagine? There was one. In 21 years, there's been one. At 21, I'm sorry, 20. At 21, there's been 70. So those are really rare to have these players come in. And look at 21. 97 is the average fantasy points, and that is so much above 22, 23, and 24, and 25, 26, 27, looks to 28. Look at that. So if there is a 21-year-old coming into the league this year, they probably need some deep attention. Okay, I don't remember a lot of people discussing that, but to make it that young probably says something about them. Okay, so if we look across the peak of average, and like I said, at 32, we're probably 32 years old maybe, and that's the highest peak, uh, which is kind of interesting. So you're getting players that are been around a long time in about 28. So I would think 28. You could, I mean, we're talking 300. So if you look at the impact of the numbers, and I suspect 28 is that number for peak age right there. And rushing, looks like some of these young wide receivers are can be used for rushing, but by the time you get to 28, 29, they're not being asked to rush much. So you could probably predict that. Receiving yards, again, we're probably, I think 28. I'm satisfied, even though the data is a little skewy there. I think there's not much difference between 516 and 481 versus the actual numbers in the pool there of 300. So I think for the most part, you should consider 28 as kind of that optimal peak for wide receivers, which is longer or older than in running backs, which is getting close to 25, 26, right in there. So there's a seasoning and a survivability of wide receivers that is not so much in running backs, which is interesting. Okay, so I plotted this, and you can see the counts here from 23, 24, and then of course you're dropping, like I said, below. Like I said, about 32 is about as far as I'd want to go. And the fantasy points, like I said, at 28, you're still got a lot of wide receivers, and you see the trend, and it's starting to plateau and drop. And I think you can ignore this data out in here because we're talking, what, 2 or 3 people? So I think pretty much the beginning of wide receivers, the peak is 28. But notice that they can hold on. So this, I think for Dynasty, the myth is that yes, we're losing wide receivers, but the ones that are hanging on and they're still able to produce are going to be productive. I think at between 28 and 32, I'm not overly worried if they're productive. Okay. Yeah, if they had injury issues, if their production has gone down in their early 30s, that's a problem. But I'm not overly concerned until probably 33 or so. That's just kind of my take on this data here. And again, the fantasy points, like I said, 28 is still that number right here. And I think the trend pretty much starts and plateaus right there at 28, 29, 30, 31, and by 32, you're right there. Okay, so I know there's this hypersensitivity in Dynasty. And there's an idea that, oh, I need to get rid of players. And I wonder if that could be premature. But look, I'm not a Dynasty expert, so I can't claim to be at all. But I think 28 to 31-ish, I'm probably okay with keeping. And so people say, oh, I want to get rid of them early. Well, then to me, if I was using that paradigm, I would say 30 years old. And I bet you a lot of people are thinking that as well. Just that 29 sounds younger than 30. I mean, they're a year apart, but that 3 in front, people kind of knee jerk, oh, that's old at 30. So you might be able to take advantage and pick up some productive wide receivers, 30, 31, 32, and hold them for a little bit, kind of rent them for a few years if they're still producing. So I would definitely urge you to consider the data, but do be aware of the decay rate of wide receivers. But it's not like running backs at all. So now I have EXP, this is experience, and then I have count numbers of age, count of, that should be count of experience, and the players. And look at the data, we're talking 800, and by 5 years experience, you've half, 8 years experience, you're half again. And by 10 years, you're 1/8 of what you started with. So to me, 10, 11 starting to get really dicey in experience levels. But notice the average fantasy points is still fairly high here. What's happening is the weak are gone and what's left is the strong. So there's that story that for wide receivers, that an older wide receiver is not necessarily a bad thing. We talked about age, but here's experience as well. So I'm willing to take older wide receivers. Just starting to worry at 12 years of experience. It's clear that's where the decline is starting at 12 years. Obviously, you have to open your eyes up, make sure we watch, make sure the injury. Okay. Rushing. Notice the peak rushing is 6 years. So if we've seen in the previous lesson that rushing was kind of picking back up for wide receivers. I wouldn't want an older wide receiver to be rushing. Looks like 5 years of experience is about, where you want, but really 3 years. So I think there's that idea that some of these youthful wide receivers still have some juke to them. And I think the older seasoned ones are a little bit smarter and know how to place their body and know the tricks of the trade. Reception yards, again, are peaking at 11, but the start peak is somewhere between 7 to 9, I think is pretty much there. So again, you do have to worry about the numbers as well. But I'm willing to keep an older wide receiver, 9, 10, 11, because those that have proven themselves, that in some ways are really giving you the most bang for the buck there if you look at the reception yards and the fantasy points. So I don't know if there's a dynasty. Remember, I think in Twitter, people will say things and it may be more for dynasty than redraft. So I don't play a lot. I have one, I guess I have 2 dynasty leagues now. And I think wide receivers, I think you could be more forgiving of their experience and age. And I think that's just very clear from the data here, folks. And I think the Twitter people forget about redraft because a lot of the Twitter experts do dynasty. And so when you see some discussions about getting rid of players and realize they may be coming from a dynasty perspective, which may or may not and probably will not reflect what we need to consider for redrafting there. Okay. I plotted the years of experience is 1 year to 16 and the average fantasy points, and I believe you can see that according to this, peak is what, 11 years right there, and then you're starting to decline at that point. So you're really seeing if you try to flatten it here, I believe 7 years, in some ways, you've about hit the best you'll see at 7 years. So somewhere between 7 and 11. And notice that's a wide gap. And you do not see this in running backs at all. Go back and review those lessons here. So that's how I would look at this data. And this is showing receptions and the trend line of reception in the red line, and then the boxes versus the circles are the rushing and the rushing trend line. So very clear that the older players are not rushing a lot, and that probably makes sense. And so if somebody is making their living as a wide receiver, for instance, Deebo Samuel, at some point he's just going to get too old to do it. So don't expect that rushing component the rest of his career. Okay, it's not going to be there. Okay, and some other wide receivers as well. So again, 11 is the peak, and for reception yards. But to me, about 7 years is that you're hitting kind of that beginning plateau. In other words, if you were to free draw this and kind of connect, it would be close to 7 here, would be that kind of that beginning. So I think 7 years is, I guess with 7, I would not expect much more dramatic situation. Look at rookies versus year 2. People talk about breakout. It's almost, 200. So we're talking a third more, 30, 40% more. And you don't see that increase until maybe 4 to 5. You're getting that breakout there. And remember, by 5, you're about half the wide receivers are left. So I think what this is showing us is the ones that have survived the first few years and are still in the league, getting their second contract, getting their extensions and all that. I think that's happening at 5, and that's why you're seeing that gap there. And once 5, 6, really it's not, maybe it's more 5, is the time. So a combination of the survivorship and the production there. But people talk about the breakout. The way I see it, the breakout is 2nd year and 5th year. I think if you made that second contract and that second, that next tier, to me, I think you've arrived. So that's how I think, certainly in redraft, that's how I would look at this. So in your draft notes, you definitely need to find your 2nd year and your 5th year coming into your 2nd, coming into your 5th year. That's how I think I would live with this data, which is interesting. I don't know if people are thinking about this. And again, this is over 21 years of data, which starts getting. Okay, let's focus now on this slide. we are now looking at the rank sector of 100 to 75 percentile. And this is at the end of the season. This is wide receivers. So we're looking at the best wide receivers across the whole season. And of course, I'm looking throughout the 21 years. So I only looked at the top 25 percentile wide receivers. So the best of the best. And then I looked at the experience in those wide receivers and then had various categories. First category is average of fantasy points. And when you remove pretty much the underperforming wide receivers below 75%, so 74 and down, you see that the peak of 7 years experience, the fantasy point average really jumps out. I put a blue star here, so it's very clear now that that is the key. So if you're a dynasty player, this looks like it goes to what, about 9 years, and then you start seeing somewhat of a decline, not a great decline, but you do see a decline. And remember, all at the same time, wide receiver numbers are dropping. So I think if you wanted to be very conservative, you would not hang around past 8 years, right? Take the 7th year and then move them. Okay, but you need to decide that because, like I said, it's clear that the best wide receivers that are hanging around are still producing. It's just, you're not getting peak levels. And again, I don't know how you do that or how you play. Next thing to consider is in the previous experience material in the average fantasy points, we saw, and I talked about a 30% jump from year 1 to 2, and that's in all wide receivers. However, if you look at the top 25%, we only see about a 10% increase. And eventually we will see from year 1 to 7, we're seeing about a 20% increase. So if a wide receiver is a rookie, is showing out already and is making their presence known, being in the top 25, they're not going to give you that 2nd year, 5th year boost that you may have heard about, because I think people were looking at the combined data and didn't parse it out further. So there's a misconception out there that somehow there's this great movement up. That's not the case in the top wide receivers. Okay, so if you're expecting a great wide receiver a rookie year 1 to somehow increase 30% in year 2, that's not what we're seeing, and that's not what I'm saying. Okay. However, that implies, if you look at the previous slide on the total wide receivers, that there are some underperforming wide receivers, rookies, that just did not get a chance to show out. So finding those, you may then see from those a 30% jump or more. So I think your hunting should be restricted to that 2nd year pop, not of the best wide receivers, but of the ones that you think were underperforming. Maybe some new stuff has happened, a new coach, a new team, something, and that might help them, break out. They've obviously got to have the talent to make that. So it's implying that something happened their rookie year that they did not get to live to their potential. So it's not just a knee-jerk grab all 2nd year wide receivers and wait for the 30% to come to you. You're not going to necessarily get that. And again, this is on average. So that means there's going to be, poor and really great wide receivers in that whole population. But the idea that somehow the top rookie somehow is going to break out in the second year to be even 30%, the data's not telling us that, not at all. You will get a 20% increase by, say, year 7. That's possible. So there'll be a slow movement up, and I did mention a 5th-year kind of peaking situation, and so again, that is kind of suggested here that we're starting to get the best of the best 5, 6, and 7. That seems to be those years there. And that might extend to years 9. So you got the sweet segment there for your wide receivers. My dogs are restless today. So think about when you're looking at 2nd year, 5th year wide receivers, exactly who we're looking at. Are these the best, top 25? Or are they below that? And why are they going to really perform better than you think, especially the rookie to 2nd year? Okay. There's no evidence here of a 3rd year breakout that I've noticed. So I don't know where that came from, but the data is not telling us that. So it's more of a 2nd year and maybe a 5th year breakout in all wide receivers, but not in the best wide receivers. You're getting that 20% over 7 years. So that's a little bit, so dial down your expectations. Okay. Next category is rushing, and as I stated, the best wide receivers that are rushers are going to be young. Okay, look at that. They're starting to hit the downside by 4 years. So do not expect Deebo Samuel is, a high, well-known one to somehow keep going. Okay, on average, he's going to be dropping by about, a third or a fourth. So, years 3 and 4. So just don't be, surprised and overpay and think you're going to keep that rushing dividend. You're not, on average. Okay. Reception yards. Now, this is what was interesting to me. Even in the best, we are seeing 100 more yards from rookie to year 2. Really a nice little thing. So that's what, 1/8 or so. So that's not bad. 100 year more. So fantasy points is not so dramatic, but the actual yardages are pretty good. So you can get a little bit of an uptick there. So I believe I wouldn't ignore that 2nd year breakout in the top, but I think you're better served finding the ones that didn't, the rookies that didn't show what they should have shown. Just to kind of go a little further, that would probably mean that rookies that were buried in the depth chart, rookies that were drafted high but didn't show out their first year, that would tend to be, in my opinion, some of the candidates, or maybe some that flashed at the, say, end of their rookie year, or there was some reason they had 2 or 3 games they strung together and really showed a breakout kind of situation. That would be the ones I would be looking and trying to acquire, and you might get them at a bargain. And again, peak-wise, we're finding the reception yards year 7, and we're starting to see that decline by year 10. So again, that 5th year break to the 7th year, that sweet spot, and you might get as much as 9 years out, but you're really peaking at 7. So I would definitely use this as a barometer to get rid of that in your dynasty. And certainly in redrafts, if you're starting to look at some of these old dogs, you better be sure exactly what you're getting and make sure they're still viable in the pecking order here, because on average they're starting to decline year 10 and or so. So just be aware of that. Here's the counts of the ones that were tops, and this is the total wide receivers, and then the percent of the best. So the rookies, only about 10% of rookies, wide receivers, will find their way to the top. 20%, so an almost 8% increase by year 2, 5% more. And notice that as we go into the age here and the experience, we got 35 here that are in the top out of 70. So almost half that have survived to 11 years are still good. So what that's saying, if you find a good one, they're not going to somehow blow up on you. I mean, this data says probably you can even play to the 11th year and even some further out. So there's that running underneath the data that you could be tricked by. So old, seasoned wide receivers, 10, 11, 12, they are the ones that are in the top are really high in the total that are, available in the league, that started there. So be aware of that. This number is really very interesting. And if you look at the, who's left, you can see that 5 years you've lost half, right? So 48%. So 8 years you've lost 3/4. So like I said, that peak is about the same time you've lost a lot of wide receivers. They're gone. Okay, they're not in the league anymore. So it's a nice attrition rate. But the ones that are in the league, okay, notice their proportion are the really good ones. So teams are not letting the old dogs hang around for other reasons other than they're producing. So just be aware of that, and you can use this to kind of think about that movement. So as the sand is spilling out and the losers are being selected against, the winners are popping through and representing more of the population as you're going into the experience. Okay, so that is not the case in wide receivers per se. Their decline is a lot more dramatic than this if you'll go and look at those lessons. Okay, so the next slide then is shown here. This is wide receivers 2021, top 25%. So this is the top end of the season EOS players. Experience versus average, and I plotted that and got a polynomial trend line. Don't worry about that. I think it's a good way to look at the trend versus a simple linear kind of thing. We ain't got time for that, folks. Let's make it real here. Look at the peak, 7 years. There it is, right there. So there's that second year increase. This is the 5th year increase. So that is still available here and still part of the trend. And you're getting the sweet spot 5 to 7, maybe, and you're still kind of viable at 9 years, but then you're starting to decline. So I would definitely use this trend line and start worrying about getting rid of the hot potatoes in your dynasty, certainly 8 and 9 years, unless there's some of the best there. Okay. This shows the experience versus reception and rushing. Here's the rushing in the blue line. It's declining here, and you probably shouldn't even be worried about it after about 4 years. So Deebo Samuel's not going to keep rushing for 15 years, okay, on average. And here's your reception, that first to second year bump, and here's that 5th year bump, and here is the peak at 7 years. So again, don't know what you heard out there in Twitter land or whatever. This is the data as I find it, okay? So, it's time, I don't know who's your sources here, who's your data daddy. Oh, I like that. Dr. Bush is your fantasy football data daddy. Whoa, I like that. That's good. Data daddy. Anyway, so while the rest of these blowhards are flipping around like old crappies out there, crappie's a type of fish here down in Arkansas, flipping around like an old flop, crappie flop. I'm trying to give you the real deal here, so please come back. Pretty much love that visual. This is the process. My name is Dr. John Bush, and data is your friend. Okay, come back. Last lesson in wide receivers next time.